Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Kahrl Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Hey, something that Bloomberg has reported quite a bit on over the last few years. It's about how flawed assessments for America's hundreds of billions of dollars in annual property taxes hit Black neighborhoods hardest. Local officials have overvalued the lowest price homes relative to the highest across the U.S., this according to nationwide data. For example, from 2006 through 2016, inaccurate valuations gave the least expensive homes in St. Louis an effective tax rate almost 4 times higher than the most expensive. You can go through city by city.
Makes no sense.
And you see these examples continue.
Yeah, and then there was the cover story on the equality issue of Bloomberg Businessweek. You probably remember it. It was about 3 years ago. It was about now Georgetown law professor and author Dorothy Brown, who wrote a book about how tax laws still discriminate against Black Americans. She joined us on air after that because it was something that, just really important and talks about the inequalities in terms of tax policy over the decades.
We continue to look at the issue today, this time with Andrew W. Kahrl, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia. He's got a new book out. It's called The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. He joins us on Zoom from Virginia. Andrew, good to have you with us this afternoon. I think when a lot of people think about discrimination, they don't necessarily think about the tax structure here in the United States and how that has played into discrimination over the past couple of centuries. So talk a little bit about how you approach this issue.
Yeah, I mean, my book really looks not just at tax policy, but at tax administration. And that's where the devil in the details really emerges, because in many instances and historically, African Americans have been subject to discriminatory overassessments at the local level through, not necessarily through explicit policies, but through administrative procedures and intentional discrimination. Or today, often we see these kind of structural flaws in the assessment process that consistently produce the types of inequalities that you noted at the top.
It's pretty remarkable, at least from a property tax perspective here in New York City. One thing that I've noticed is the burden, at least for property tax, is on people with less expensive condos versus some of the multi-million-dollar brownstones.
How does that happen?
I don't know how stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild to see here. That this is here in New York City, Andrew. It hasn't been fixed.
Yeah, no, I mean, this again, it's nationwide, and property taxes have been shown to be regressive in practice, even though they should be, in a sense, like a tax on wealth, one that takes more revenue from the highest value properties than the lowest, but instead it's upside down. It's, as you've noted, it's the opposite. And that really disadvantages African Americans because, as we know, their neighborhoods and their homes are devalued on the open market because of racism within the real estate industry and the practices of and preferences of home buyers. So they're kind of getting the short end of both sticks. They're both being devalued on the open market and then overvalued when it comes to taxes, which further devalues their property. Because again, if you're higher taxes, then sort of get factored into the value of those homes.
Well, we spent so much time and I feel like over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, coming off the pandemic, coming off of the murder of George Floyd, looking at the gaps in society on so many different levels, especially when it's Black versus white. Having said that, how did we get here and why does it continue to persist today?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's important to know is how much autonomy and discretionary power local tax assessors possess, and how much that has shaped some of these dynamics on the ground over the course of, as my book shows, 150 years. But I mean, this is something that has consistently undermined African Americans' attempts to acquire and accumulate property in America. And I really show how, at every stage in African American struggle for equality, you will see these instances in which local tax administration and public spending as well, where do those tax dollars go, and the enforcement side, how are, say, tax sales operated, or how can those be abused, you continue to see this, these types of forces undermining that struggle for home ownership and the wealth building opportunities that it presents.
But go back to after the Civil War, right? Because you got to like kind of understand history. I mean, this is, I feel like we as Americans, and we still don't know really, I think it's safe to say, many would argue, we really fully understand the American history yet. But you've got to go back. And in this case, go back after the Civil War. Talk to us a little bit about what happened and how this kind of almost had some of its origins back then.
Yeah, I mean, you see really from the moment of emancipation, two things that are happening simultaneously. One is African Americans are striving toward building up a land base. I mean, land was synonymous with freedom for that generation of African Americans who came out of slavery and their children and grandchildren. And by 1910, African Americans had accumulated over 16 million acres of land in the U.S. That was a remarkable achievement, and it was done in the face of all forms of sort of either racial terrorism or these kinds of forms of bureaucratic racism that my book uncovers. Again, like tax assessors who will overvalue Black-owned land, homes, while at the same time, like grossly undervaluing the richest and most valuable farmland. And one of the things I sort of show is really after Reconstruction, after Reconstruction's overthrown, white supremacists come back into local government. They're not just taking over Senate seats and governor's offices, but they are also, regaining control over tax assessors' offices. And once they do that, they very quickly restore the old system of, the wealthiest people pay the least and the poorest and most disadvantaged pay the most. And we've continued to see those sort of dynamics play out over time. And it's been a real uphill battle for generations of African Americans to fight against this.
Still, though, Professor, there is this racist trope that has been perpetuated by white Southern elites and segregationists that is still perpetuated today, I think, that Black people in the U.S. don't pay their fair share in taxes. Your book has many instances, many examples that show that they've actually overpaid for decades.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one of the most sort of frustrating things for African Americans as taxpayers is to consistently have to sort of call out this lie that has that sort of myth that African Americans essentially don't pay much in taxes and by implication then don't deserve the public's money when it comes to public spending on services and programs. This served a political purpose. It served to justify the policies of neglect that we saw under Jim Crow. The fact that Black schools were horribly underfunded, and it served to justify all sort of manner of inequities, like not paving the streets or putting in sidewalks in Black neighborhoods, even in instances where I find where like the water mains are narrower in Black neighborhoods. All the public spending and inequalities that generations of African Americans were struggling against were in many respects rooted in this myth that was used to justify these the unequal spending practices and the policies of just outright neglect that white-controlled local governments carried out.
One thing that struck me is despite the fact that African Americans have historically paid more than their fair share of taxes, they have not been the beneficiaries of things that taxes are supposed to provide: schools, infrastructure, and more in their neighborhoods. Give us some examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is really when you look at local tax systems, it's so important to understand like where's the money coming from and where is it going. And you can see over time and still to this day that African Americans get a smaller share of the public goods and services and benefits that local governments provide. In the past, that was often explicit and deliberate, whether it be Jim Crow governments that would just siphon off the tax dollars and push them into white schools at African Americans' expense. Today, it's often sort of even more structural in that you will have, say, cities or localities or school districts that are flush with tax dollars because they have a large tax base, because their housing markets are strong, they attract lots of business and industry, so they have lots of tax dollars to spend on public goods and services. And then you'll have maybe the next town over, a place that has a very small tax base and large needs and is unable to provide those goods and services. And it is no coincidence that usually the wealthier, larger tax bases are predominantly white communities, and the ones that are suffering from smaller tax bases and greater needs are African American. And that's because of the way housing markets work and the way that wealthy and advantaged communities, shape their housing markets to be exclusionary. So this again is another example of how the local taxation kind of reflects and exacerbates these existing problems within housing and schools in America.
Professor Kahrl, safe to say we at Bloomberg have been reporting too about this. I feel like for the last few years here, it's something, your book is really deep, a lot of information explaining how we got here. And it's interesting because I do feel like we still have a society where people are like, wait, this is going on. So why isn't it getting better? What's still holding it back? Is it those people who are in political office? It's not a priority, or they're not getting attention? What is it?
Well, I think you said it. One thing is certainly at the national level, property taxes have not been a priority of our nation's leadership. Really going back, it's really been since the 1970s, the last time this country really had a serious conversation about reforming local tax systems and addressing these problems within the property tax. So that's one problem. It just hasn't been on the nation's agenda. And then secondly, because it's not, these battles are only being fought at the local level, like one assessor at a time. In many respects, like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to, say, localities that have small tax bases, they can't solve these problems on their own. They need sort of larger solutions to this, and really ultimately ones that are going to have to happen at the federal level.
Professor, we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. It's a fantastic book. It's out now. It's called The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. That's Professor Andrew W. Kahrl, Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia.